Yeah. I know that's what Christy says. She just don't want to she doesn't like the concept of being closed in. Yeah. 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 Mount Nebo outside of Russellville. Yep. Yep. I know what you're talking about. So, Brandon, are we on? Are we live? Awesome. All right. Which, by the way, huh? That's right. That's right. Everybody's having a good time. So, you're talking about somebody saying, "Hey, the Bible says this," and that's not necessarily always. I mean, that was one of my things when we were over at Southside, and there was a group, and I want to try not to be too overly critical, but there was a group, a Christian-based group that really campaigned against before we had the lottery and a lot of all that kind of stuff here in the state, and had good stuff to say, I guess, but one of the things that I would just, as people were talking about, oh, we don't need the lottery here, we don't need gambling, blah blah blah. And I would just, almost as devil's advocate, I'd be like, well, tell me in the Bible where the verse is about gambling. And they're like, well, it says in there, yeah. And you can't find it because the Bible never addresses it. Huh? I know, they cast lots, which, actually invoking God's will is rolling dice. I mean, that's really what, yeah, exactly. How are we going to pick another apostle? Come on, 7, I don't know. Did he put his chip down on a certain number and then? All right, so we'll start out live online with heresy. All right, that's a good way to start class. I'm glad to be back with you guys. Those of you joining us online, thank you for being with us too. I missed out being with you last week, but I know Brandon did an outstanding job filling in. So we got to the end of our discussion of the 10 Commandments, and we're going to start a new study today. But before we do that, I kind of want to wrap up the 10 Commandments. Not saying that Brandon didn't do that last week, but I want to kind of put my final, I don't know, stamp of approval. That doesn't sound right. My 2 cents worth. That's right, on the 10 Commandments. So, so let's go back through them real quick. If you got either Exodus chapter 20 or Deuteronomy chapter 5, let's look at the commandments real quick one more time. I want to start in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 6, where it says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your ox, nor your donkey, or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gates, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, so that you may live long and that it may go well with you in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not set your desire on your neighbor's house or land or manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. These are the commandments the Lord proclaimed in a loud voice to your whole assembly there on the mountain from out of the fire, the cloud, and the deep darkness. And he added nothing more. And then he wrote them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. So, as Moses kind of going through, the commandments, and again, the Deuteronomy version is the same as the Exodus version, but it's just after the 40 years of wandering around the wilderness. So, the one thing that a couple things I want to point out about these commandments. Okay, first of all, here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, just to set the context again, this is when the Israelites are getting ready to go into the promised land. Moses is getting ready to die, and he knows he's not going to go into the promised land with him. And so the whole book of Deuteronomy is really Moses kind of rehashing the last 40 years. We were in Egypt. We got, God brought us out. He's brought us in the wilderness. He's been with us this whole time. We've had some really good things that happen. We had some not so good things that happen. And so kind of going through their history and then saying, now you're getting ready to go into the promised land. Here's some things to be ready for. And here's some things you're going to need to do when you get there. And that's what the whole book of Deuteronomy is all about. Now, he reiterates these 10 commandments, here in chapter 5. But then I want you to flip over a page or, scroll or click a page, whatever, to Deuteronomy chapter 6. So even if you're in Exodus, I want you to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 6, if you would. Come on in, girls. So I'm going to start reading in verse 1. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 6. These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach you and to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all his decrees and commands that I give you, and so that you may enjoy long life. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, so that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, promised you. Now, this next part will sound somewhat familiar to some of us. Starting in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these commands that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, and bind them on your foreheads. Write them down the door frames of your houses and on your gates. The reason I wanted to kind of show this to you, we have in chapter 5 him going through the 10 commandments, and then there's other commands too. But then in chapter 6, he kind of says, I want to impress on you how important these laws, these commands really are. This is what God wants for his people, and then he kind of, in a way, sums up all of the commandments that he just went through in chapter 5, with this statement in chapter 6 and verse 4. Okay? And he says, Hear, O Israel. Listen up, Israel. Pay attention. If you haven't been listening to this point, pay attention now. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. And that kind of, in a way, I think, sums up all these other commands, right? I mean, why do we have no other gods? Because we love the Lord our God. Why do we not misuse God's name? Because we love the Lord our God. Why do we observe the Sabbath day? Because we love the Lord our God. But even the stuff with how we treat each other. Why do we not take someone else's life? Why do we not steal? Why do we not lie? All those different things. Part of it is to help us obviously get along with each other, but part of it is I love God. And I love who he is and who he's shaping me to be. And because I love him that much, I love him with everything that I am, with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my strength. That's because that's my goal, because that kind of summarizes who I am. Then I want to do these things. I want to keep these commands. Does that make sense? So then he takes it a step further and says, when do you need to talk about this stuff? When do you need to talk about these commands? Look at verses, What does he say? All the time, right? So when you get up in the morning, you talk about these commands. When you lie down at night, you talk about these commands. And that's kind of a way of saying, and all the time in between. So, have these commands on your minds, on your hearts, and maybe even discussing them with other people all the time. And then he goes on from there and says, not just you, but who else needs to know these things? Your kids. Talk about it with them. Talk about who God is. Talk about who he's calling us to be. So why do you think that was an emphasis for Moses right after he talks about these commandments, right after the Big Ten, as we've been going through them for the last few weeks? Why do you think that the next thing that Moses says is you need to talk about these things with each other, and you need to impress them on your kids. You need to write them down. You know, why the emphasis like that?
Well, he knew how short-term their memory was.
Yeah.
Like, while he was up there getting these commandments,
Mm-hmm.
they left the one true God and built a calf, you know?
Right.
And so he's like, you need to know them, and you need to teach them to your children, because they don't need to forget this.
Right.
You know, and this is important. And if you don't teach it to your children, they will want. Now, in other words, he was saying history is important. It doesn't matter what history it is or what it says. It's important.
Yes.
To know history.
It's important to know your past. It's important to know, where you came from, and even with this, the direction that you're going, for sure.
Because when Jesus was asked what is the greatest commandment, he didn't say, honor the Sabbath or honor your parents. He said this, which really isn't.
It's not really one of the commands.
One of the 10 commandments.
Right.
But his answer was love the Lord your God.
Yeah. That's in for sure in Mark chapter 12. I think Matthew, I want to say 22-ish, where Jesus asked that question, what's the greatest of all the commands? And probably the question would be like, we have all these laws, we have all these different commands. We talked about like even the Sabbath laws in Jesus' day, there were like multiple categories and, of all these different rules and regulations. Which one of those is the greatest? And Jesus' response is not even one of the Big Ten. It's what comes after. Love the Lord your God. Love the Lord your God. Love the Lord your God with everything that you are, with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. Everything that makes you needs to be devoted to loving God. But then impressing that on our kids, because I think it's when do we learn the bulk of information, not just about how to do a job or how, we learn those things in high school and college too, but just about who we are who I am as a person. When do those things start to become ingrained into us? When you're a kid, right? There's you have a lot about your own identity and who you are and what kind of person you're going to be that is not, I'm not going to say locked in, but starts to be determined when you're a kid, when you're a child. And so, Moses is like, man, these commandments are important. You need to teach your kids about them. He's also talking to some people as they're getting ready to go into the promised land, what had their parents and grandparents done before them? Yeah. They have watched the 10 plagues actually happen. They have watched God do all these amazing things. And they get over into the wilderness, and what's one of the first things that they did? Forgot and built an idol and said, okay, this is the guy that got us out, of Egypt. I'm like, really? You just saw, but okay, because we are forgetful people, and we are, especially, we talk. I'm sure Brandon's heard this before. We have spiritual ADD. Like there's stuff that we just get distracted by, and we can go from the most spiritual highs. I mean, it happens all the time. I'm not picking on teenagers, but I see it all the time with teenagers, adults too. But especially like at Green Valley Bible Camp, right? Or a retreat or wilderness trek or something like that. And, these kids go and spend a week at camp and have this amazing spiritual high. They, leaving the gates of our church camp on Saturday, just like lives are going to be changed forever. And by Sunday, they've moved on to something else, I'm not blaming them. I probably did the same thing if I thought back in that time. We struggle. And I think God knew that about us. And so he tells his people, like, you need to have these things on your mind. You need to talk about them with each other. Now, for us nowadays, does that mean that we need to sit there and go, tell me what you think about the third commandment, Linda? I mean, we need to have those kinds of discussions. Well, I guess you can, but I think the bigger principle is there is we need to be in a habit of having spiritual conversations with people. Even something as simple as, this is what I saw God do, this week. This is something that I see. This is the way that I see God working, or maybe even this is the way I'm struggling with God right now. And we'll have conversations about, I don't know, Razorback sports and shopping and, food. And, Shelly walked in the door. What did we talk about? Her vacation. Like we're talking about all these, and none of that's bad. How often do we just have conversations about God's presence in our lives? And again, I'm not saying that in a critical way. I'm saying that in a personally challenging way. God says, if you don't keep me on your mind, and if you don't keep having conversations about me, what's going to happen? You're going to forget. And I don't want you to forget. So keep me at the forefront. Does that make sense? So I wanted to make sure to make that point as we wrap up talking about the commandments. The other, I guess, and I don't know, I think because Brandon and I had a conversation last week after this class, and I don't know if he mentioned it in class or not. So I may be rehashing something that you shared, Brandon. So I apologize ahead of time. But there's one story in particular in the Bible where one person in pretty much one act violated about half of these commandments. Okay. How many of you remember the story of David and Bathsheba? It's in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. Okay. So what happened with David? Somebody tell me really quick. Things are great. He's king of Israel. Things are awesome. He's amazing. He's got this close relationship with God. And then what happens? He sinned. How so? How did he sin? With Bathsheba. Okay. So, yeah. Okay. So let's go through the story. Hold on. Let's go through the actions first. He sees Bathsheba taking a bath. He invites her to the palace. It's not a stranger. Her husband is one of his closest soldiers who was probably with him even before he became king when he was on the run from Saul. Don't know that for sure, but quite possible that they've been. Huh? Oh, he had multiple wives. Yeah, he already had several wives before. Yeah.
He wasn't where he was supposed to be.
Not where he's supposed to be. He's on the roof of his palace when he should be out on the battlefield. He brings Bathsheba to the palace. They have sex. She goes home, ends up being pregnant, tells him, I'm pregnant. He brings Uriah from the battlefield, which is where he was supposed to be, and tries to get him to go home and have sex with his own wife, and then everybody would think that it's her baby. He won't go home because he feels guilty about, being home while all his buddies are out there fighting. So David then tries to get him drunk so that he'll stumble home and have sex with his wife and think that it's his kid. That still doesn't happen. So then he sends a note back with Uriah to Joab, put him at the front, then drive everybody away from him, let him be killed. And Joab does that. So basically he carries his own death notice, however you want to, death sentence, with him to Joab. Okay, so all right, so let's go through it. How many different commands did David violate there?
At least the last 5.
Okay, so for sure, adultery, obviously, having sex with someone that he wasn't married to. Matter of fact, married to somebody else. Murder. Okay. Did he try to cover it up? Oh, yeah. So lying, false testimony, lying. Coveting. He saw something that he didn't have and wanted it for himself. So that's 4.
And stealing.
Oh, yeah.
I guess stealing, because he kind of stole,
I see something that I want to take.
Yeah, and taking it for himself. So that's 5. And then I would even throw in there, now this might be a little bit of a stretch, but, we talked about having no other gods, not having something more important to me than God in my life. at least for this moment, he did. So that's at least 5 or 6 different commands that David broke right there. What are you going to say, Brandon?
No, just whoops.
Yeah. And it's and okay, so let's call it 5. I mean, half, maybe 60% of the Big Ten that David violates in this one instance. So what was supposed to happen? Yeah. I mean, we read through these different commands. The adultery stuff and the lying. I mean, those had some stiff penalties to them. Did he suffer any of those penalties? No. So was God just letting him off?
No. There's consequences.
There were consequences.
He lost a mighty man. He lost his child. And you and I've talked. That moment is the downward moment.
Yeah. Everything for David's life up to this point, man, things are great. He can do no wrong. He can lose no battles. He is popular. He seems to have, even with all of those things, seems to have a close connection with God, And after that, you read through the rest of 2 Samuel. It's not that everything goes wrong, but a lot of stuff goes wrong. His kids, oh my goodness. One of them rapes another one. One of them murders that one. And then that one that murdered the other one ends up overthrowing David and sleeping with his concubines. And also, it's a mess. Well, there's another son that ended up killing another one too. It's just a mess. It's, and it's these consequences, which is what God said. When you violate these commands, there's going to be consequences. And it's not just going to affect you. It's going to affect generations after you. And we see that. We see that multiple times in the Old Testament, but that's just that one clear picture in the life of David of someone who walked away from these commands and suffered some pretty significant consequences from it. But at the same time, what happened for David?
God forgave him. I mean, he was forgiven. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Now, you can't outdo God. You can't out-sin God.
Mm-hmm.
God will forgive you.
Yeah.
And bring you back.
Yeah.
If you're willing.
That's right. And for anybody that says that the Old Testament is all about condemnation and laws and judgment, the Old Testament is full of grace, and you really see it with David. Read through Psalm 51 when he's confronted by Nathan, with Nathan the prophet with his sin. Psalm 51 is just David pouring his heart out. God, I have messed up. And it's interesting to me because he says in there to God in that psalm, he says, against you and you only have I sinned. And I'm like, well, Uriah too. He kind of sinned against him. But I understand what he's saying. And he's looking at it's a confession. I have completely violated this relationship that you and I have had. And so he says in verse 10 of Psalm 51, I need a brand new start. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Let's just start over. And God allows that to happen. And I guess that's the other kind of bow that I want to tie on our Ten Commandments study, is that we can look at the Ten Commandments, and they're all said in a kind of in a negative, almost condemning way. You shall not, and it can produce a little bit of intimidation and fear. And I guess rightfully so, and that God's serious about those things. But there's also forgiveness and grace. I don't want you to do these things. Do not do these things. But if you do, I'll forgive you if you want it. If you want that relationship restored. And so that's kind of the final thing that I wanted to make sure that we understood from the Ten Commandments. They're not just rules and regulations and condemnations. There's still a lot of grace there. And even the commandments themselves, those things are grace-filled. The reason God gives those commands is because he wants good things for us. Your life will be better if you do these particular things. So do these particular things. I want good things for you. So here's how you live the kind of life that I'm calling you to live. Does that make sense? Okay. So any final, we're going to get into our new study, but I didn't get a chance last week to, like I said, to tie my final bow on the study. So I wanted to make sure to be able to do that today. Any other thoughts from you guys over the last however many weeks that we've been studying the Ten Commandments together? Or questions, things that you came up with and we never did answer? Brandon, any 2 cents worth?
Unfortunately.
Go ahead.
I was talking to Laurie not too long ago about, like, with teenagers, sometimes rules are just so constricting. And so, like, man, this stinks. Like, I'm trying to live my life, and there's all these rules, especially spiritual rules, Ten Commandments and stuff. Like, you're trying to rein me in. And at the very end of Deuteronomy, Moses points out, he's like, man, I've set before you life and death. You can choose life, you can choose death. And he says, choose life.
Mm-hmm.
You have the opportunity to choose life. It's not that these rules are constricting. It's like, why do we have speed limits? Because if we were just able to do whatever we want, most likely we'd get ourselves killed.
Yeah.
So it's not restricting as much as it's preserving our life.
Yeah.
And that's what all the laws are hopefully here in this world for, but especially these laws. These are not constricting. These are life-giving.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think it's hard for us to think about that.
Yeah.
As teenagers, think about that too.
Adults too. Holy cow. Yeah. So just in case, if you're online didn't hear all that, I'll summarize. We don't like rules, and we find them constricting, I think was the word you use, and confining, and they can actually be liberating. The thing, especially the rules that God gives us, they're there to give us freedom and to give us life, and that's what they're there for. That's what He gave them to His people for. That's what He continues to call us to obedience for. And again, I just showed Deuteronomy Chapter 6 where Moses says, "Love the Lord your God." Okay, so 1,500-ish years later, all the way over in the end of your Bibles in 1 John, John says, how do you know that you love God? We need to love God. How do you know that you love God? You do what He tells you to do. Same principle, same concept, okay? So I hope our study through the commandments has been something good. Maybe helped them make a little bit more sense and not seem so confining and restricting. So, okay, let's jump into our new study. I don't know if you saw on our social media post ahead of time what we're going to study, but I got a couple of suggestions from people about what to study next, and this kind of seemed to be the best way to meet a couple of those questions. So we're going to start today on a study of the book of Ephesians. So that's all the way over in the New Testament, probably about halfway through. So you get past Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that talk about Jesus' life on earth. You get past Acts, which talks about the church starting. You go a few more books further, and you get to the book of Ephesians. Okay, so that's what we're going to start studying together today. So, we're gonna study Ephesians together. So before we jump into that, I kind of one of the things that I wanted to get our minds thinking about what I see as the central theme of Ephesians. Let me interrupt myself. If you even just do a Google search of study of Ephesians, you're going to find dozens of different opinions on what the main focus, the main theme of Paul's letter to the Ephesians is all about. And I'm not going to say any of those different opinions are wrong. There's so much stuff in here. I don't know that we'll get to delve into all of it. And part of that is because I think y'all get on to me sometimes for taking too long with some of my book studies, and it's only 6 chapters, and that could take me a year. So I'm going to try not to do that to you. But there is a lot in here, a lot of different topics that Paul kind of dives into, and so there's one piece of it that I think is kind of a central theme throughout the whole thing, and I'll tell you about that here in a second. So let me ask this question. When you were in high school, and we have various ages represented in this room, various ages represented online. So if you're watching online, I want you to feel free to comment as well. How would people now describe you back in your high school days? Like, what's some of the adjectives that, would be used? This is a safe place. All right. There's no judgment here. I'm already seeing like people not wanting to, people like looking at the ground. I don't want to say what I was like in high school. So I'll get the ball rolling. And when I was in high school, you would have seen me as, first of all, really skinny. I know you probably wouldn't believe that, but if you see pictures of me in high school, I was like Brandon-esque. I was really skinny in high school. I always had a big head, but I was really skinny. But you, like my high school friends, and some of them may be watching. I don't know. As a matter of fact, if Brian Davenport's watching, he might be able to confirm some of the things that I'm saying. But I would have been considered obnoxious, immature. I already talked about that this morning, before we got class started. Immature, fun-loving, prankster, always got something to say. Those would have been some of the things I think to describe me. I was somewhat, I guess, somewhat athletic. I made decent grades, but if you're just going to describe me like kind of my identity as a person, I always want to be the kind of the center of attention, or at least in the group of people who were the centers of attention. Does that make sense? And I really wanted to make everybody laugh. That was my big thing. So I was the guy. Lori talked about how she always in classes or whatever always wanted to sit at the back of the room. I was that guy too. I always want to sit at the back of the room so I can make my sarcastic comments about whatever the teacher was saying or doing, and just try to get a laugh out of everybody. That's part of my identity. Okay, at least my high school identity. All right. Anybody else? What would people have said about you? What did people say about you? Outgoing.
Friendly.
Okay.
A little rebellious.
All right. A little rebellious.
Ran away from home while I was in high school.
Oh wow.
Friend.
Okay. Ran away from home. Wow, that was all right.
Got caught. Got suspended.
Came back home. All right.
But yeah, a private person.
Okay.
Which I probably would still say I am.
Yeah, outgoing to a certain point, and then I'm going to kind of make sure that I'm sheltered off.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Phyllis. Anybody else? Loud.
Yeah, which I still am. That's fine.
Yeah.
But I was in yearbook, so I knew like a little bit of everybody.
Yeah.
So it was kind of cool. Plus, I became friends with my teachers, so I could do whatever I wanted.
Okay.
So
So kind of a schmoozer with the teachers. Can I say that? All right. All right. For your own personal benefit.
oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Anybody else?
Sassy, maybe.
Sassy.
Maybe.
Wow.
Multiple actions.
Wow. Maybe, or definitively, I guess, apparently. That's so funny. Yeah. Okay, that's it, just sassy? Okay. Were you athletic? Okay, good. Good, okay.
Like softball. But I also had pink in my hair and wore skinny jeans.
Okay. So, a little bit unique, huh? Punk? Okay, we'll go with that. All right. All right, good. Anybody else?
I'd say I got called like a goody two shoes, like you didn't cuss around me.
A goody two shoes, really?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Very involved, athletic.
Played a lot of sports.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I knew a lot of people because of that too.
Yeah.
I was a class president, so that's kind of like.
Yeah. No, that's
Like,
good.
you
That's
should
a good
have
thing.
felt
Yeah.
Like I did the right thing.
Yeah. Made the good choice. All the, like people liked you, but even teachers liked you too.
Oh, well, my mom worked at the school, so I didn't really have
Oh, yeah, that's true. See, my mom worked at the school too, and then I would get the silent treatment when I got home, which meant somebody talked to my mom, and then I'd have to, yeah. Well, they wouldn't even ask me. They were just like, I'm going to tell your mom, or they wouldn't tell me, but she would be in the teacher's lounge, and then, yeah, I get home from basketball practice, and my mom's, cooking dinner or something, and I'm like, hey, how's it going? And she didn't answer. I'm like, oh no. And I'm trying to run through my mind. What was it today? What did I do today? What would somebody have told her about? So, Brandon, what were you in high school?
Oh man, there's things that you would hope people would say about you.
Yeah.
But I was probably kind of like Daisy, a little like goody two shoes.
Mm-hmm.
I had my crew that I ran around with, but it was like really just those dudes. But I did know just about everybody. I was in newspaper and all that fun stuff, and so I got to go and experience everything.
Knew everybody, but kind of a. I won't go so far as to say prude, but at least a goody two shoes.
Yes.
Yeah.
On
Okay.
the cross country team, they called me Preacher God because not because of anything besides Coach knew that I was a Christian and wanted to do ministry.
Yeah.
He made me pray before everything. So it's like, oh gosh, I'm gonna be doing this the rest of my life again.
Yeah. Did I ever tell you there was a kid that used to come in Green Valley from the Seneca or Joplin area that everybody called Preach?
That's dope.
That was his nickname, was Preach, because same kind of thing. Like, he was the one that, whenever we asked for volunteers to pray or whatever, everybody just turned to look at him and was like, all right, I'll do it. And they're just like, Preach. Yeah. Anyway, okay, so how would that compare? Let me ask this question then. By the way, did anybody online offer anything about themselves?
Nothing.
That's okay. Yeah, okay, that's fine. They'll stay silent. Yeah. Let me ask this question this way: How would you do you feel like you're the same person now that you were in high school? Phyllis says yes. Okay. Laura, you're maybe a little wiser, but still kind of the same person. Laura, you're saying no. Okay. Can you elaborate why?
I was kind of like I was kind of like a party girl in high school, and I was kind of like, I don't know, just boundaries weren't really a thing.
Yeah. Not too many boundaries in high school.
Where now I'm a little bit more, I think I've kind of flipped it. Like, before I was, well, let's try this, that sounds fun, let's go do this. Well, now I'm like, oh my gosh, we can get hurt.
Yeah. A lot more cautious now.
Yeah. I think having kids is a big part of that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it also is becoming a Christian because a lot of the things I was doing then.
Yeah. So your faith had something to do with that too.
Yes, my faith
Okay.
definitely had something to do with it.
Yeah.
As far as just choices I make and stuff like that. But I think having the kids changed like my vulnerability. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, watching them do stuff, I'm like, that's not, don't do that.
Yeah.
And I look at what I did and I'm like, I did way worse.
Yeah. How funny.
It's kind of one of those, do as I say, not as I did.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. I'm much better now. Yes. Anybody else? How do you compare nowadays to, when you were a teenager? About the same? About the same?
I like to think I think before I speak.
Okay. A little bit wiser. A little bit. We didn't hear any comments this time. The sass.
Mine doesn't go worse.
You're more sassy. She's reined it in a little bit. Okay. I remember having our 10-year high school reunion, and I got voted by my classmates as most changed. And, I like to think that was because of maybe some physical features or something, but I'm pretty sure people are like, God, we couldn't stand you in high school. Well, you're all right now. I'm just kidding. I don't know. And the reason that I want us to think about, like, how do we see ourselves? How do we view ourselves? And that changes. The way other people see us changes. The way we see ourselves changes. And I remember back in youth ministry days, especially with junior high kids, getting big sheets of like butcher paper and having kids, lay down on it, and you draw their whole body outline. And then you just give them, some markers and just go like, start telling me about yourself, or defining parts of yourself. And they do face like, they draw the hair and the eye, trying to, the physical features. Okay. But tell me about yourself. And then you'd start getting someone like, happy, or someone like scared. Some would say smart. Someone would call themselves dumb. And there would just be these positive and negative traits that these kids would see about themselves that either they saw in themselves or other people had labeled them as. Does that make sense? And some of those things, obviously change through our lives. Some of them stick, and we start to believe some things about ourselves because of how we view other people, or because of what other people say about us, and it kind of determines somewhat our identity. And that's what I think the whole theme of the book of Ephesians is about. Okay, so if you got your Bible apps and your Bibles open to Ephesians, go all the way over to chapter 4. Now, hear me say, I don't necessarily think that Paul sat down and before he wrote this letter was like, let me think of the common theme that I want to use here. I'm not saying that at all. What I see in the book of Ephesians is this recurring theme throughout the whole book, but it's described the best here in chapter 4. Okay, so beginning in verse 20 of Ephesians 4. Paul says, "You, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness." It's this picture that Paul puts in front of the Ephesians of a old self and a new self. And he says this, before you met Jesus, before you became a Christian, here's who you were. But now that you got Jesus in your life, now that you've given your life to him, you become a Christian, you've put your faith in him, you've been baptized in him, this is who you are now. And you got old self, you got new self. And what we're going to see, I hope, as we go through Ephesians together, we're going to see all these different things that Paul describes about us, about being children of God, about being moved from darkness to light, about being moved from death to life. All these different things, they have this recurring theme of Paul saying, this is who you are now because of Jesus. This is who you were. This is who you are now. And so, this summer, matter of fact, we went through the book of Ephesians in our camp session together with our teenagers, or the campers there. And our theme for the week was identity. Who am I really? Who does God say that I am? Who is God shaping me to be? And I feel like that's kind of that's the key word to me when I read through Ephesians. It's Paul going, this is who we are now. This is who you are now. There may be all these different labels that you had before Jesus, but this is how you need to see yourself now, because this is how God sees you now. Does that make sense? So that's going to kind of be our theme throughout this whole study. Now, let me go. I know I'm doing a lot of the talking today, but let me go, Bible geek on you a little bit and give a little bit of background to the book of Ephesians, and then we'll jump both feet into chapter 1 next Tuesday. Okay. When Paul writes this, he's in prison in Rome. If you guys remember our Philippians study, we talked about Paul being in prison in Rome. If you go and to find out why he's in prison, you have to go to the end of the book of Acts. He gets arrested while he's in Jerusalem. He gets falsely accused of creating a riot, and in that process, he, as a Roman citizen, appeals to Caesar, and which means he has to go all the way to Rome, and he can have his court case heard by, the emperor of Rome. But that can take a long time because the Roman Empire is really, really big. And, everybody that wants to come see the emperor, it takes a while, for that to happen. So he's basically under house arrest in the city of Rome. He's probably in a little one room, not even one bedroom, but like a little one room place that would have a pallet or some kind of a bed. And he would have a Roman soldier they're chained to each other. He would be on one end of the chain, this Roman soldier would be on the other end while he's in prison. And people could come and visit him. They could bring him food. They could bring him clothes, whatever he needed. But he couldn't leave. He couldn't go anywhere by himself until he had his court appearance. Everybody with me? So that's what happens at the end of the book of Acts. Now, this is around 60 to 62 AD, so about close to 30 years now that the church has been around. And that's where Paul is, as far as we know. He calls himself a prisoner of the Lord, and most scholars think he's in prison in Rome when he writes this letter to the Ephesians. Okay? Now, what's his connection with this Ephesian church? We talked about in our study with the book of Philippians. He had a very close connection with the Philippians. Considered them to be some of his closest, I guess, Christian friends. They were a very big source of encouragement for him. What's interesting about the Ephesians is the church is in the city of Ephesus, which, as far as we can tell from the book of Acts, besides maybe early on in Paul's ministry when he was living in Antioch, because we don't know for sure exactly how many years that he was there, this is probably the city that he spent the most time in. So if you go through the book of Acts, you can find all the different cities that Paul went to and all the different churches he established. He spent a lot of time in Corinth. We got the letters of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He had spent a lot of time there. He spent a year and a half in Corinth. But if you look in Acts, in the book of Acts, chapter 19, you find out about Paul's time in Ephesus, and he spent actually over 2 years in Ephesus. Okay, so you can turn there if you want to Acts chapter 19, and just see some of the details there. I'm not going to read verse by verse, but just to give you a little bit of details about the city of Ephesus. Does anybody remember what the city of Ephesus was famous for during Paul's time? Huh? Their gods and goddesses. One goddess in particular. Diana, also known as Artemis. So her Greek name was Artemis. Her Roman name was Diana. She was, I guess this famous god as far as Greek and Roman mythology is concerned. The city of Ephesus itself, at the time that Paul was there, had anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 people living in and around that city. This is a pretty big city, even by ancient times.
New York City or Chicago.
Yeah, right. It'd be like L.A. or Chicago or New York, for us nowadays. It was, especially in the Roman Empire and the civilized culture of the day, it was really one of the hubs, one of the main cities. It's on the western, kind of the southwestern coast of what is now Turkey. It had a harbor, and that was one of the things about it. Not just being on the coast, but it had an actual harbor that was safe for, the Mediterranean Sea is known for rough seas. And it had, especially back in ancient times, we didn't have motors on your boats, and, you didn't have as much control over your vessels. Ephesus was great because you could safely bring your boat into harbor, and it could be there for a while and, load and unload goods and passengers and all those kinds of things. It was the capital of this Roman province of Asia, and it also had four major highways coming in and out of the city. So whether by sea or by land, there's a ton of people. It really would be like New York for us nowadays. There's just lots of different cultures represented here. Lots of different people from lots of different countries that have either been brought here or have made their way here. And lots of different architecture, lots of different, I guess, kind of modern marvels of the day. There's a theater in Ephesus. I don't know, Brandon, you've been there. Is it still there?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. 25,000 seats in this theater, which is kind of built into, a hillside. It's a big, amphitheater, but it seated 25,000 people, had 3 levels of seats, and 22 rows on each level. And the theater itself was 100 feet high. So lots of people would come in and see, performances, hear speakers and stuff like that. And then there was the temple of Diana, or the temple of Artemis, which is one of the original 7 wonders of the world. And I'm pretty sure there's part of it that's still remaining nowadays. Huh? There's one pillar left? Okay. That's all that's left of this. And if you ever see any documentaries or just even read some of the historical accounts of just how amazingly intricate that temple was, it was 4 times bigger than the Parthenon. So y'all seen pictures of the Parthenon in Greece. The Temple of Diana was 4 times bigger than that. Okay, had 100 columns. It was the first, one of the first structures in the ancient world that was made entirely of marble. So it would just been this gleaming structure up on kind of the top of the hill. You could see it for miles. This amazing structure, this place of worship for Artemis. Now, just to let you know who Artemis was, she was in Greek mythology, she was the daughter of Zeus. She was the twin sister of Apollo. She was also known as the queen of the universe. She was the goddess of the hunt and the wilderness and wild animals. She was also the goddess of healing, especially diseases in women. And she was also a fertility goddess. So she helped your crops grow. She helped you have more livestock. She helped families grow. She was the goddess that you prayed to aid you in childbirth. And then she also, or I guess her followers eventually kind of incorporated sorcery and magic into her worship as well. Okay. And that's all by the time Paul shows up there. And so when Paul came to Ephesus, it was probably in the 50s AD. So several years before he actually wrote the letter to the Ephesians. And if you read through Acts chapter 19, he shows up first at the synagogue, which is what he would typically do. I need to look at my clock. Okay, I can do this. I got a few minutes left. I can do this. He shows up at the synagogue, and which is what he would typically do when he went to a new town, because he would go to the Jews first, who had a knowledge of God and had an awareness of a Messiah, and he would talk to them like, hey, the Messiah has come. Let me tell you about it. His name is Jesus. And he tries to do that for 3 months. He tries to do that at the synagogue there in Ephesus, where all the Jews were meeting to worship. And they don't want to hear it. They don't believe him. They drive him out. So he goes next door. I believe it's Tyrannus. This guy had a building. His name was Tyrannus, the lecture hall of Tyrannus. That's in verse 9 of chapter 19. And he spends 2 years going there almost every day and just talking about Jesus, to the point that Jews and Gentiles both throughout the whole city have an awareness, at least an awareness of this guy Jesus that Paul is talking about. But then Acts chapter 19 goes on from there to say that Paul had miraculous powers that God gave him as well, and that he could heal people. It says in verse 11, God did extraordinary miracles through Paul. Verse 12, so that even handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched him were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured. So just take your handkerchief, touch Paul with it, go touch a sick person with it, and they get healed. Now, why would that be a problem in the city of Ephesus? She's in charge of healing. Okay? So if and you gotta understand, I talked about this temple and this worship. Like the temple of Diana was so big, and there was so much wealth that it generated, because people from all over would come and would, bring money to offer to her, or to, have the upkeep of the temple going on. It had its own bank. Like you could get loans, from the Temple of Diana. You could do your banking there, because there was so much wealth being produced by the worship of this goddess. Now you got Paul showing up, and he's talking about Jesus, and he's healing people, and only Diana and her followers were the ones that were supposed to be able to do that. So there's a problem. And you keep reading, and you find out there's this guy. Well, so many people are impressed. I got ahead of myself. In verses 17 and 19, it talks about people were so impressed with the miracles that Paul's doing, the message that he's preaching, that they start giving up their sorcery. They start giving up their magic. They have big book burnings of all their incantations and magical potions and all those kinds of things. They burn all that stuff. And it says that the cost, the value of the sorcery books that they destroyed was 50,000 drachmas, which would be over $1 million in today's money. That's how much they destroyed because they were so impressed with Paul and his message about Jesus and the miracles that he was producing. So you can see how this would be causing a problem for some people, especially people associated with the worship of Diana in the city of Ephesus. So they end up, there's a guy named Demetrius who's a silversmith who used to make little idols of Diana. And he gets upset, and he gets a bunch of the other silversmiths together, and they start a riot against Paul and against Christianity. And they grab some of Paul's buddies, and they rush into, Scripture says they rush into the theater, this 25,000 seat theater. And, I don't know how they got everybody fired up to get in there, but there's thousands of people that rush in, and they're all yelling, and some people don't even know why they're there. There's people yelling stuff, and they're like, all right, well, let's go yell stuff too. And they're all in this theater, and Paul wants to go in and address the crowd, and his companions hold him back. Like, you go in there, they're going to tear you to shreds. Like, you need to stay out here. And they had this huge riot against Paul and against Jesus and against Christianity because of the message that he's preaching. That is a quick summation of Paul's 2-year experience in Ephesus. Not too long after this, he leaves. A couple chapters later, when he's on his way back, right before he gets arrested, he comes back and meets with the leaders of the church that he helped establish in Ephesus, and he tells them, I'm not going to see you guys again. I'm getting ready to be to go be persecuted in prison, maybe even die. And I'm saying all that to say, the church that Paul helped establish in Ephesus was in the middle of a it wasn't a tame city, and it wasn't I don't know what the word is I'm looking for. It wasn't a completely safe place to be a Christian. And so when he writes this letter back to them, when he's in prison, they've heard he's in prison. They've sent people to him to check on him, and he's sending this letter back to them. There's not much in here where Paul's really griping at the church. There's some things that he talks to them about and warns them about, and some things that he wants to reassure them of. It's not like Galatians where he's getting on to them for walking away from their faith, and it's not like the Corinthians where he's getting on to them for all sorts of different things that they had going on in their church. Paul's letter to the Ephesians is much more, it has the feeling more of, hey, this is going to be tough. It's already been hard to be a Christian where you're at, and it's going to continue to be tough. And I want to tell you these things so that you can be confident in them and sure of them and know who you are. Does that make sense? Okay. Matter of fact, the book of Revelation, Jesus in Revelation chapter 2 addresses the church in Ephesus, which would have been written after Paul wrote Ephesians. And Jesus, even in Revelation chapter 2, says, you guys have done a really good job of staying faithful in spite of persecution. And he said, now we got an issue. You've forgotten your first love. You're walking away from how strong you used to be and how connected we used to be, and I need you to get back to that. But there's still an acknowledgement, even years after Paul writes Ephesians, there's still an acknowledgement from God going, this is a tough place to be a Christian. And I get that. Hang in there. It's worth it. Okay? So I wanted to kind of set the stage for when we get into chapter 1 next week. When Paul's writing to these folks, there's some of these folks that he's had at least a 2-year relationship with. He spent a lot of quality time with some of these folks. And he's worried about them losing their sense of identity in Christ. They're going to go back to their Jewish roots. They're going to go back to their Diana worship roots. They're going to just walk away from their faith altogether. And so all these different things that he's going to address, or we're going to look at, is calling these folks back. Remember who you used to be. Be confident in who you are now. That if nothing else over the next few weeks that we walk through Ephesians together, that's why I'm hoping for all of us, that we get reminded of maybe who we used to be, but who God says we are now because of Jesus. Okay? I know I did a lot of the talking today. I apologize for that. I want to have a little bit more interaction from you guys next time, and I'll try to do a better job of that. All right? So go ahead if you want to, by next Tuesday, read through chapter 1. We won't get all the way through it next week, but we'll at least dive into it. And, the first thing right off in chapter 1, Paul uses words like predestined and foreknew and stuff like that, so we can even delve into that a little bit. Yes, ma'am?
How many years was that before they started persecuting Christians in Rome?
So Paul's in prison, in somewhere between 60 and 62 AD, and that real full-scale persecution from Nero started probably around 64, so probably just a couple of years after this. Mm-hmm. Most of the persecution that you see in Acts, and even right after the book of Acts, was not from the Roman Empire initially. It was from Jews. It was mostly from Jewish people going, we don't want to buy into this Jesus thing, and we don't think you should either. And so when Nero was having all his political issues, and he burned the city of Rome, and he blamed that on the Christians, and found out he got kind of a good reaction from that. So he kind of starts making that more of his policy. And then other emperors after him just kept repeating that.
Originally, they thought Jesus was coming to help them overcome everything. I mean, the Jews did overcome Rome, didn't they?
Right. That's what they thought the Messiah was going to do. Yes. Yeah.
Our Savior, per se.
Right. Yeah.
Wanted to get all the time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. So you're right on the cusp of persecution happening. It just wasn't as full scale when Paul's writing this letter as it's about to be. And not that Paul had necessarily a sense of that, but it's probably, most scholars think it's probably about 2 years later when he's arrested again, and that's when he's writing like 2 Timothy and things like that, where he's like, I'm about to die, and it's tradition says that it was Nero who ordered him to be beheaded. It was Nero who ordered Peter to be crucified and stuff. So that's still in the 60s. Just this is 60 to 62, and that stuff happened around 64 to 66. Mm-hmm. So hadn't happened yet, but it's about to. Good question. Anybody else? Okay, let's jump into Ephesians 1 next week. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for joining us online. See you next week.
Thank you.
You're welcome.